Hi, this is again April 21st, and I hope you're all doing okay, not bouncing off the walls too badly. So what we want to do now is to do comparative statics with short run and long run international finance diagrams. And I'll break this into more than one lecture video. But let's start in. So first of all, over here, I'm going to put we'll do long run first. So in the long run, we have a supply and demand for loanable funds. There we go. And on this axis, we have, we can call it various different things, but let me call it investment plus capital flow. That's also investment plus net exports, because capital flow equals net exports. And on this axis, we have the real interest rate. Okay, so there's a real interest rate determined here. Now, before I go on to put the other three diagrams, the other three graphs over here to make the complete diagram, let's do the short run, how the short run is different. Everything over here, the graphs are going to be the same, but over here, the short run graph is different. And so I'm going to keep a very, very simple short run graph. In the short run, the way we're going to think about it is simply that the central bank chooses a real interest rate. Okay, very, very simply. So here's the interest rate that they choose, and that's it. Now, that goes back to supply and demand for the monetary base combined with the level of inflation. Supply and demand for the monetary base determines the nominal interest rate. Then you've got a certain level of inflation, and the real interest rate is equal to that nominal interest rate minus inflation. And I could distinguish between expected inflation and actual inflation, but in fact, it's pretty easy to predict inflation at least a few months out. Not perfectly, but well enough so that the recent history of inflation tells you pretty much what people are going to be thinking of in terms of expected inflation. And then I should point out here that nominal interest rate is indeed determined by the supply and demand for the monetary base. There's the demand for the monetary base, there's the flat part at the interest on reserves. And typically nowadays, the Fed is keeping the supply of monetary base big enough so the interest on reserves basically determines this interest rate, or at least the nominal interest rate, which then after subtracting inflation gives us the real interest rate. All right, so that's how the short run and long run are different. In both cases, what we're getting out of this is an interest rate, but the inputs into getting the interest rate are different. Okay, in both cases now, we have the next graph over here is capital flow as a function of the real interest rate, and we've got the quantity of capital flow on that axis. So CF of R, because it's a function, that represents a curve. CF by itself just represents a quantity, as does the CF here. That's the same quantity, and then the quantity of investment. Then the third graph is investment as a function of the interest rate, and we have the quantity of investment over there. I didn't leave enough space. And this interest rate comes over here and determines the quantity of capital flow. Now that quantity of capital flow is important for a lot of reasons, but one of the big reasons the quantity of capital flow is important is because the quantity of capital flow gives you the supply of dollars. If folks are in the US, for example, are buying lots of European stock, then the folks who sold that European stock end up with dollars. If they're folks in Europe, they don't really want the dollars. So when they turn to the foreign exchange market, they're supplying those dollars. They're saying, I actually want to get rid of these dollars. Down here, notice up here, it's all the real interest rate on the axis. Down here, we're going to put the real exchange rate on the axis. Okay, now, then of course we have the demand for dollars. What is the demand for dollars? The demand for dollars as a function of the real exchange rate is the same thing as the net exports as a function of the real exchange rate. You need to get dollars from people's purchases or net purchases of assets in order to be able to buy more from the U.S. than you sell to the U.S. One way of thinking about this is how much we sell and how much more we export than import has a lot to do with the financing for it. If we're willing to provide lots of dollars to the rest of the world, we're providing financing, we're providing loans to the rest of the world that allows them to import from the U.S. more than they export to the U.S. And of course their imports from the U.S. are exports from the U.S. So anyway, we have the supply of dollars, which is a vertical curve at the level of this quantity of capital flow. And then we have the demand for dollars, which is just equal to net exports as a function of the real exchange rate. Notice we have real interest rate, real exchange rate. These are, what's on these graphs is in real terms. The only nominal thing that comes in at all is if we're in the short run. In the long run, it's all real. As usual, nominal things don't matter in the long run. But even in the short run, the only nominal thing that really comes in is, or the two nominal things are this nominal interest rate and then inflation, and the difference between them gives the real interest rate. Once we get the real interest rate, it's pretty straightforward. Now, I haven't aligned things perfectly. This real interest rate would come out at a different level on this graph over here than what I showed back here. Okay, so there's our graphs. I'm tempted to, what I want to do is now pause and ask for questions, and I will, but do send me questions on email. There's also the discussion bit on Canvas, which I will check, and so do ask questions and you know, set up a time in office hours to talk to me. This is complicated stuff. Okay, so now let's do an experiment. So what I want to do is imagine a shift in the net exports as a function of real exchange rate curve, which is also the demand for dollars curve. Imagine that for any level of the real exchange rate, folks want more net exports. So there are kind of two experiments that could do this, two reasons this could happen. Okay, so I'll write those down. So here I'll draw it in orange. So here's our demand for dollars prime, which equals net exports as a function of epsilon prime. That's not a derivative, that's just a different function. We have to reuse alphabet letters. We have to use primes for various purposes. Here it means a shifted curve. So what could do this, they're kind of two stories. You don't need both of these, but either, and I'm sure there's more things, but either U.S. goods get more attractive. Actually, I know I realize there are at least three things, because you could have foreign goods get less attractive, so we want to import less. Okay. And you know, if this is whether this is a good or a bad thing depends on what happens. U.S. goods getting more attractive would be a very good thing. Foreign goods getting less attractive, not so wonderful. But then the third possibility is that you have tariffs or quotas. So you have trade barriers. I'll just write tariffs or quotas. Now, the not so accurate intuition that many people have is that trade barriers should increase net exports, because you're taxing imports, so that should reduce the amount of imports and raise net exports. And indeed it does for a given real exchange rate. But what we can see from the graph is that the real exchange rate adjusts so that at the end of the day, there is no change whatsoever in the quantity of net exports. And I should label this axis down here. This axis gives me the quantity of net exports, which equals the quantity of capital flow. So the quantity of net exports doesn't change unless the supply of dollars changes. You can't get people buying more U.S. goods relative to what the U.S. imports unless you provide loans for them, financing. You know, just like you know, the auto dealership would have trouble selling a lot of cars if it didn't help people get loans to get the cars. Similarly, it's very tough for us to sell more exports than the imports unless we somehow provide loans for the other countries to be able to buy those things. So, you know, and there's more than one way to think of the accounting identity between capital flow and net exports, but that's one way of thinking about it. Now, remember, one thing I should point out is what's on this graph is really intentional capital flow. The unintentional capital flows before the dollars get recycled, those are not of great interest because they last for quite a fairly short time. It's the intentional capital flows that come from wanting to buy foreign assets that, you know, relative to foreigners wanting to buy our assets that matter. And of course, remember, why does the quantity of capital flow go up when the real interest rate goes down? It's because as the real interest rate goes down, you get a measly return in the U.S. You go abroad looking for greener pastures, better places where you're going to get a better return. And then, of course, over here, lower interest rate means that of all the heterogeneous investment projects, more of them look worthwhile, so you invest more. Okay, so now, the reason I started with this experiment is because, believe it or not, it actually has the very same result whether or not you're in the short run or the long run. Let's take a look at the short run case. So in the long run case, you got the real interest rate determined. That determines the quantity of capital flow. Then this says, oh, net exports don't change. Real exchange rate goes up. That means the dollar appreciates. U.S. dollars get more expensive. To folks in the U.S., the euros and yen look cheaper. What happens in the short run? Okay, well, I've got the wrong level of the real interest rate there unless I lift this up. So let me lift it up briefly. Now imagine I was lifting it up. So I've got my real interest rate here, which again determines the quantity of capital flow. That determines the quantity of net exports. Again, the quantity of net exports doesn't change, but the real exchange rate goes up. You know, your intuition would be that net exports would go up, and not just your intuition, the President of the United States' intuition is also that way. but the real exchange rate goes up enough so that the net exports go back to where they were, and you just have a change in the exchange rate. The dollar gets more expensive. One thing I didn't draw was also there's not only no change in the quantity of capital flow, but no change in the quantity of investment. So that's so a lot doesn't change. Nothing happens in these top three curves. And down here, nothing happens with the quantity of net exports, because after all, that's determined up top by the quantity of capital flow. And the one thing that changes is the real exchange rate. Okay, so that's, there we have it. That's one experiment. Now let's go to one more experiment on this video, and then I'll save the rest for a later video. So, okay, actually there's no harm in leaving this as it is, but let me, oh, no, actually, no, I do want to change this, so let me do an experiment here, and this is, I started with the easiest experiment. Now let me start with another relatively easy experiment. Boy, as I do this, I want to kind of ignore this orange stuff. So rather than redrawing everything, let me kind of cross out this orange change. So if you're able to ignore that, that's good. And we'll start with a purple change. Okay, so imagine the orange wasn't there. May be difficult, but you can try. Now I want to think of an increase in saving at any interest rate. So we're going to go to a different saving curve, S prime. That, remember, S can stand for either the supply of loanable funds or the saving as a function of interest rate curve. So I'll just label it S for supply of loanable funds, but it is the saving curve as well. Now what's going to happen? Well, first thing that's going to notice, I guess the first thing I should say is what doesn't happen. This demand for loanable funds doesn't change because it's just the horizontal sum of these two curves, CF of R and I of R, capital flow of R, investment of R. So the demand for loanable funds doesn't change. What also doesn't change is there's net exports as a function of the real exchange rate doesn't change, at least once I've crossed out the orange there. So now everything that happens is happening because of the change in the interest rate. Only this curve shifts, that one stays the same. So we know we get this intersection with a different real interest rate. And now what happens? Well, first of all, we get a higher level of capital flow. That gives us this purple supply of dollars prime. The other thing that happens is we get more investment. Okay, there's more investment. So we go to I prime. Okay, and with this higher supply of dollars, but the same demand for dollars, the real exchange rate goes down, so the dollar gets cheaper, the dollar depreciates, those are synonyms. You can't buy as many yen or euro or pounds with the dollar, and so things in the US look cheaper to folks abroad, things abroad look more expensive to people in the US who are used to starting with dollars. So net exports goes up to equal the quantity of capital flow. Remember, what's happening is the real exchange rate does whatever it takes to recycle the dollars, and when it does that, it ensures that the net exports equal the capital flow. So by the time we found that low interest rate meant that some of these funds went abroad looking for greener pastures, we know that provides more financing, more loans to be able to buy net exports, so the net exports go up. Real exchange rate down, quantity of net exports goes up. Now, the thing that I want to end, one of the things I want to end on is now the following question. In these two experiments, and you can still see the orange if you need to, what happened to the aggregate demand? So actually stop the video and try to figure that out. What happened to aggregate demand? Assume, for the sake of argument, that government purchases stayed about the same, well, ignore government purchases, but we can talk about them in a minute. Okay, if we ignore government, okay, so hopefully you come up with an answer. Let me go ahead and try to answer it. So if we leave government purchases aside for the moment, what happens here is investment has gone up and net exports have gone up in a way that's not driven by the income itself, and so those are autonomous. I should write down that word. A-U-T-O-N-O-M-O-U-S. Autonomous is a little bit like the word exogenous. It means it's a little closer to being a starting place, but it's not exogenous here. It's just exogenous in that other arrow diagram that had the C plus I plus G plus NX equaling output and then the positive feedback loop. Okay, so we have I and we have I up, we have NX up. Now, if I want to ask about government purchases, the lower real interest rate should reduce, by itself would reduce the government budget deficit. Probably the government will feel it can spend some more. I can put a question mark there, but it's likely that G has gone up. So this is going to be, you might think actually this would be, I'm tempted to say this would be stimulative, but now my problem is that in fact this is in the long run. So notice how I've gone down a not so great road. I've been thinking about aggregate demand in a long run model where that's not really the key thing. How is it that I in fact don't have an increase in aggregate demand? It's because notice what got the ball rolling was an increase in saving for any given interest rate, and even though the interest rate comes down, the quantity of saving has gone up. So here's quantity of saving prime equals I prime plus CF prime. And then I had the original level of saving. So this higher level of saving is corresponds to a reduction in consumption. So, I might have been tempted to think of, and in fact I was tempted to think of this as if it were an increase in aggregate demand, but it isn't. In the long run, the aggregate demand ends up being equal to the natural level of output. Whatever the monetary policy is, it doesn't affect the long run, and so I have more investment in net exports and maybe more government purchases, but a reduction in investment. Okay, so let me now go to the short run where that kind of aggregate demand analysis is more appropriate. So, okay, so what's going to happen here? Well, instead of having an increase in saving, let me imagine that the Fed just cuts the interest rate. So now, if I do that, actually the rest of this diagram doesn't have to change. What's happened with the Fed cutting the interest rate? You have more quantity of capital flow. You got a lower real interest rate, more quantity of capital flow, more quantity of investment. That extra capital flow causes a higher level of net exports. How does it do that? Well, the price system comes in action to get the dollars back to the U.S., and that's a depreciation of the dollar, making U.S. goods look cheaper to folks abroad, and foreign goods look more expensive to folks in the U.S. So net exports increase. Okay, so same story, but now my aggregate demand analysis is a little different. So my aggregate demand analysis is, well, I can certainly see that investment went up. I can see that net exports went up. And I'm even going to say government purchases, because of the reduction in the real interest rate, likely go up. I'll put a little question mark there, but I think that's likely true. But now things are different. In the short run, aggregate demand doesn't have to equal, aggregate demand doesn't have to be equal to the natural level of output all the time. Presumably, hopefully the Fed is doing this to get things more in alignment. But in any case, we've got, let me do C, I, G, and X. Those all add into aggregate demand, which equals GDP plus, and that has a positive effect on consumption. So what happens is, from this diagram, I can see when the Fed cuts the interest rate, the investment and net exports and probably government purchases go up. That makes aggregate demand higher. In the short run, that makes GDP go up, and GDP is not forced to be equal to the natural level of output. So in other words, sometimes Y is not YN in the short run. But consumption will go up too. So I've got, here I have investment in net exports, probably consumption, probably government purchases, and I have consumption going up. So I add all this up, and aggregate demand definitely goes up, and GDP definitely goes up. So when the Fed cuts interest rates, it's definitely stimulative, okay? And you can see that. And presumably, hopefully the Fed is doing this because aggregate demand was too low, because aggregate demand was below the natural level of output to begin with. So the Fed can perfectly well raise and lower the interest rate to get aggregate demand to what it should be. What should it be? As I said in the last lecture, they should make aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output. So again, to contrast this with the long run, in the long run, how do we make, here the Fed just makes the interest rate go down, or other central bank. Here, it's the market forces. Fed has no control over the real interest rate in the long run. Let me emphasize that. Central bank has no power over R in the long run. And I'm going to put 5 exclamation points there. This is not the doing of the central bank at all. This is people want to save more. That makes the real interest rate go down. And, in the long run, I've emphasized this, in the long run, aggregate demand automatically, not automatically, but through a variety of adjustment processes, the aggregate demand equals the natural level of output. That means that this reduction in consumption has to just match the increase in investment in net exports and government purchases if that happens. So anyway, thanks for listening. I'll bet you have some questions here, and do send your questions, and send me an email to set up time in office hours, and we'll talk more. Bye.